Do you ever wonder why this system leaves you feeling bereft, empty, hopeless and despairing? I spoke to economist Anwar Shaikh on my podcast Under the Skin, available from Luminary, and get it on Apple anywhere in the world. Anwar spoke in depth about the hopelessness, the futility and the greed of the systems that we live within, that tell us that they're progressive, that tell us they're the best solution. He says as long as there's a strong profit motive, there's nothing we can do. I asked him a simple micro question about the world of hospitality, how there isn't labour available. I said, why can't you just pay people more money to do jobs like waiting on tables, being busboys, doing stuff like that? His answer reveals a great deal about the nature of our current economic systems and why they are inflexible. If you want to understand the world, if you want to understand politics, if you want to understand why it don't make no difference who you vote for, who you elect, you always get the same basic result, you should watch this video. Stay to the end, I've got more to tell you.
In this country, like post-Brexit, post-COVID, a lot of hospitality industry, they have trouble now finding labour, low-paid labour for the positions that I guess would have conventionally been fulfilled by migrant labour. At least that's one narrative that's being offered. And like, I mean this anecdotally as well as sort of more broadly culturally. When I was talking to my friends, I'm like, you know, that would have restaurants or whatever, and I'm like, why don't you pay them people more money then? Like then, you know, that's the threshold. And well, we can't afford to pay them more money because our business. And I'm like, well, then isn't your business sort of artificially held together by like a requirement for poverty? And what kind of business is that? So what kind of, in that micro example, what kind of critique of capitalism is available, and what does those little examples tell us?
Well, first of all, there are two types of labor that are resisting now. One type is people who have seen the light, so to speak. They are working under conditions that are better, and they're reluctant to go back to those conditions. Not reluctant to go back to social interaction and all that, but go back to the dreary, uniform discipline of working for corporations and struggling to excel and not having social connections that they want. And that resistance has taken the form of people saying, well, you know, I don't think we want to come back, at least to the conditions you had before. But there's another kind, which is people who would like jobs, who have been displaced and are desperate for jobs, but can't find them. I mean, New York City runs on that second aspects also. All those people who deliver everything that we buy from Amazon, which is on my block, a huge number, UPS, Amazon, so on. Those people want to work. They want more work. They want better conditions, but they don't have the option of not working. They want to fight for better conditions. And that brings me to the question you asked, well, why don't you pay them more? And the answer is because it does cut into profit. One of the things the left does, which I've always argued against, is the idea that if you raise wages, you can just raise your price. That assumes that you're the only seller. But if you raise your price and there are other sellers who don't raise their wage, then you lose. So one of the ways wage rates work is that they're enforced on everybody. Then you don't get that advantage, so to speak. But you'll still get a drift away from those activities. The history of that is pretty clear, by the way. You have to force the industry as a whole. Union struggles can't take place just in one shop. They really have to spread to prevent them from being negated. So I'm, again, coming back to this gravitational field. Firms and corporations are right when they say they can't afford it, by which they mean they don't want to afford it. But also that if they do against competitors who don't have it, say as in China or Vietnam, then they may go out of business. And corporations do go out of business. People forget this, you know. The number of new businesses that fail in 5 years is astonishing. Most of them fail. So we think of this grand scheme of enterprise and all that, but it's much more like the virus issue. Mutations, changes. Most of those die out, but some succeed. And this, by the way, is Hayek's description of capitalism.
Cool.
A series of failures from which something new emerges.
Without solidarity, then, like worker solidarity is a very conventional, traditional socialist idea, it's impossible to exact or even pressure for that push for that kind of change. How then does that, when you have like governments that are resistant to unionization, resistant to the rights of the workers, even though I would start to dispute like that, those taxonomies, those systems of categorization, that even by saying even by having to unite on that basis, you're accepting the existing framework. But when governments are broadly supportive of capitalist endeavor and certainly don't do enough to regulate or resist it, even though I know what you're saying is if it became about demonopolization, you would just be reverting to an earlier state in the cycle if it was, for example, trying to chop the head off the beast or whatever. And how does, so I'm talking about the sort of relationship between government and big business and the inability for the rights of ordinary people to be properly represented at the level of the state. That's one part of my question. And the second part of the question is, in 2008, when the American financial industry was sort of kept alive by quantitative easing, is that an anomaly within capitalism, or is that part of certainly existing Marxist critiques, and is it in alignment with your analysis? And doesn't that suggest that capitalism sort of can't survive even within its own paradigm?
Okay, those are great questions. Let me start with the second one. What I've argued throughout my work, which admittedly is not exactly written in a popular style, is that capitalism has these recurrent patterns. And I show very concretely, for instance, that what I call great depressions occur in a recurrent manner. And I show them beginning in the late 18th century and going forward in a way that used to be called long waves. Upswing, peaking, down, and somewhere on the down part, what we call a Great Depression, like 1929, 1980, 78 in the US, and obviously 2008. And they're amazingly regular schedules in the advanced countries. So they're driven by something deeper. Now, historically, over time, the state has become more involved in intervening, but not necessarily in a positive way. The Great Depression led to a whole series of state interventions on banking. And these interventions all over the world were designed to prevent the bubble that exploded in 1929, that burst. Well, banks kept saying, and financial institutions kept saying, but look, these regulations are throttling us. People are making money over here in real estate, they're making money in this, and you're not letting us do. We need to be freer. And the ideology was the freer you have, the more efficient capitalism. So yes, Bill Clinton signed into law the undoing of these regulations. And sure enough, we got tremendous expansion, credit-based, all over, including consumer spending and all that. We got the bubble across the whole globe because now capitalism is highly mobile thanks to all the efforts of the WTO and the World Bank. And this explosion actually created an increase in output and employment and debt and a house of cards, and it came crumbling down. And the state stepped in this time to try to restrict that collapse. So the state has always been an active player, but not to overturn capitalism, but to give it some rails. And often the state is not able to do that. I mean, look at China now. Chinese economists understand the world better than we do. And they knew what was coming, but for various political and other reasons, they couldn't stop it. But we knew what was coming here too. In the US and the West, we couldn't stop it either because there's tremendous gain to be made from those activities. And so we would be stopping not just the bursting of the bubble, we'd be stopping the money that's been made all the way up. And there you're intervening in the interests of the capitalist class. So history of the state is another side the development of the welfare state comes from a long history of social struggles against the conditions of capitalism, and is succeeded in some countries more than others. The US is the least developed, possibly the most primitive welfare state. And perhaps Germany and France and Italy have a more developed one. But these came about because of the other side. You need to intervene to prevent capitalism from blowing itself up, to contain the resistance, so to speak, to it. So the state has been there all along, but it hasn't changed some intrinsic patterns, including what I call the gravitational field of the dominance of profit, that is given totally, not totally, but substantially new expression to that. Now, how are we going to do this on the world scale? The historic argument was that you have to have labor across countries. This was the point of the first international, right? The whole point was that you organize labor across countries, and that the workers would see that their common interest and location as workers would bind them together. It was not true. They didn't see it that way. They saw themselves first as English and French and German, or at least were easily appealed to when the tensions came, in fact, reverted back to their nationality. And this is a lesson that I think Marxists don't often pay attention to, don't sufficiently pay attention to. We're not characterized by one aspect of our being. It's not just if we're workers, we're workers. We're a large set of characteristics, some of which are more important to us and may be more evident to us at any moment of time. They may be false, the importance of these, but they are real in terms of our behavior. You can't appeal to people unless you can speak to at least a range of these things. This brings me back to your original question, the spiritual, right? You don't want to say, well, you're a worker, you're sort of an entity in my story here, and you're oriented in this particular one. You can't say that. It's not true, first of all. We don't characterize ourselves that way. And so we can't characterize other people that way. And then the task becomes much, much harder. How do you see people with all their capabilities, their needs, and their good and bad desires, or harmful and not harmful desires? And I, as I said, I don't see in the descriptions of socialism that we've had historically, or even post-capitalism, whatever that is, a concrete expression of this. And I personally don't think it's going to come out of our head anyway. It's going to come out of communities who find that space and try and show us a form, if they're not extinguished. And that's a very important thing. Capitalism is aware. I don't mean as a person, but as a dynamic, it's aware that these spaces carved out are spaces lost to the system. So there's a tremendous incentive to come in and undermine them. For profit, it's just profitable. If people cooperate in land, then it's an incentive to break down that corporation. And that's well known historically, by the way. Sorry, I went on too long.
Yeah. No, that was brilliant. That was one of the best bits.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Even though we spoke about a kind of microcosmic example, elsewhere in the podcast, he talks about when he met Malcolm X, even though he's got a Muslim background, Anwar, he's himself an atheist, but he spoke very beautifully about meeting Malcolm. He also talks about the sort of the inevitability, the sort of shark-like rapacity of our economic systems, and his sort of despair, really, in coming up with alternatives and solutions. But don't worry, because I don't feel that despair, and I know you don't either. I know that collaboratively we can come up with answers. Never again will we look outside of ourselves for solutions. We will look within and come up with them together. Let me know what you think in the comments below about this conversation. If you enjoyed it, why not have a look at this cheeky little chat? If you need to meditate right now, here's a little way out for you. The only way out is in, as they say. And please sign up to my mailing list at russellbrand.com so I can remain in direct contact with you no matter what happens.